81 minutes. That's all it took for two men to walk into a museum and walk out with $500 million in art. 13 masterpieces. Gone. Among them, a painting by Johannes Vermeer worth $250 million alone, the most valuable stolen object in the world. Rembrandt's only seascape, slashed from its frame with a knife. Works by Degas, Manet, and artists whose names represent the pinnacle of human creative achievement. 35 years later, not a single piece has been recovered. The thieves have never been caught, and empty frames still hang on museum walls, waiting for paintings that may never come home. This is the story of the greatest art heist in history. A crime so audacious, so meticulously executed, and yet so utterly baffling that it continues to haunt investigators, art historians, and the city of Boston itself. The night was March 18, 1990. The place was the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a Venetian-style palace tucked into Boston's Fenway neighborhood. And the question that still echoes through time is simple. How did they do it? More importantly, where did the art go? Tonight, you'll walk through that museum in the hours before dawn. You'll feel the weight of silence in galleries filled with priceless treasures. You'll stand beside the security guards who made one fatal mistake. You'll follow the thieves through darkened corridors as they methodically selected which pieces to take and which to leave behind. And you'll discover why, despite decades of investigation, millions of dollars in rewards, and countless theories, this crime remains as mysterious today as it did when those two fake policemen vanished into the Boston night. The story begins long before that March evening. It begins with a woman who built a palace for beauty. Isabella Stewart Gardner was born in New York City on April 14, 1840, into a world of wealth and privilege. Her father, David Stewart, had made his fortune in the linen trade, and young Isabella grew up in Manhattan society, attending exclusive academies where she studied art, music, dance, French, and Italian. From her earliest years, she possessed what those around her described as an unusual intensity, a hunger for experience, for knowledge, for the beautiful things that most young women of her station were taught to admire politely, but not pursue with passion. While other girls her age learned needlework and social graces, Isabella asked questions about the paintings in museums, attended concerts with an attention that bordered on devotion, and read voraciously about art and history and the wider world beyond Manhattan's drawing rooms. At age 5, she had begun attending a nearby academy for girls, where her teachers noted her fierce intelligence and her tendency to challenge conventional thinking. She studied French and Italian not just to be cultured, but because she wanted to read Dante in the original language, to understand Renaissance poetry without the filter of translation. Sunday services at Grace Church exposed her to religious art and music and ritual, the theatrical beauty of liturgy that would later inform her aesthetic sensibilities when designing her museum. Even as a child, Isabella understood that beauty was not merely decorative. It was essential. It was transformative. At 16, Isabella's family moved to Paris, where she attended a finishing school for wealthy American girls. It was there she met Julia Gardner, daughter of one of Boston's most prominent families. Through Julia, Isabella would meet Julia's brother, John Lowell Gardner, known to everyone as Jack. He was everything Boston society valued: wealthy, well-connected, handsome, and impeccably mannered. More importantly for Isabella, he was kind. He saw her intensity not as a flaw, but as something remarkable. He encouraged her intellectual curiosity rather than trying to dim it. When Isabella and Jack married in April of 1860, she left New York behind and entered the rigid, formal world of Boston's Brahmin elite. But Boston did not welcome her with open arms. The city's oldest families, with their carefully maintained hierarchies and unwritten rules, looked at this vivacious New Yorker with deep suspicion. She was too enthusiastic, too unconventional, too everything that Boston propriety demanded women should not be. She attended boxing matches, scandalous for a woman of her class. She spoke her mind at dinner parties where women were expected to defer to male conversation. She dressed in ways that suggested she cared more about aesthetics than modesty. Boston society whispered. Boston society judged. And Isabella, in her isolation, withered. But Isabella Stewart Gardner was not made for rigidity. She was not made for quiet rooms and whispered conversations. And Boston society, with its ancient bloodlines and unspoken rules, looked at this vivacious New Yorker with deep suspicion. The early years of her marriage were difficult. She was fragile in health, isolated in a city that felt like a stranger's home, confined by expectations she could never quite meet or understand. The social slights were subtle but constant, invitations that never arrived, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the sense that she would always be an outsider in Jack's world, no matter how hard she tried to conform. Then, in 1863, she gave birth to a son. They named him Jackie, and for a brief, shining moment, Isabella's world filled with light. She had created life. She had given Jack's family an heir. Surely now Boston would accept her. Surely motherhood would earn her the place in society that marriage alone had not. 2 years later, her son died of pneumonia. He was 2 years old. Just 2 years. The grief nearly destroyed her. Anyone who has lost a child knows there are no adequate words for that particular devastation. It's a wound that never fully heals, a presence that haunts every subsequent moment of joy or celebration. For Isabella, the loss was compounded by what followed, a subsequent miscarriage, painful and frightening, followed by the devastating news from her doctors that she could never bear another child. Her body, which had failed to keep her son alive, would not grant her another chance at motherhood. The depression that followed was so profound that her doctors feared for her life. This was the 1860s. The medical understanding of mental health was primitive. Depression was seen as a moral failing, a weakness of character. But Isabella's doctors recognized that she was in genuine danger, that grief and isolation and the particular cruelty of hope, lost twice, could kill as surely as any physical disease. They prescribed what wealthy Victorians often prescribed for such ailments: travel. See the world, they told her. Distance yourself from these rooms that smell of death and disappointment. Find something beyond your sorrow. So, Isabella and Jack traveled. They went to Europe, to Russia, to the Middle East, to Asia. And somewhere in those distant places, among ancient temples and Renaissance paintings and bustling foreign markets, Isabella discovered what would save her. Not religion, though she would develop a complex relationship with faith. Not the possibility of more children, though she would later mentor young artists with maternal devotion. But art, beauty, the tangible proof that human beings could create something that transcended death and time and grief. A painting could survive for centuries. A sculpture could outlive empires. Art was the one form of immortality humans could actually achieve. In 1875, during a visit to Italy, Isabella saw something that would change the course of her life. In Milan, she toured the private collection of Gian Giacomo Poldi Pezzoli, a wealthy collector who had arranged his Renaissance art in rooms designed to evoke historical eras. The paintings weren't just hanging on walls in neat rows like specimens in a museum. They were living in spaces that honored their origins, surrounded by furniture and tapestries and objects from the same periods. The collection was open to the public, a gift to the city, a palace of beauty that anyone could visit. Isabella told her companions that if she ever inherited wealth, she would create something similar, a place where art could live not in the sterile halls of traditional museums, but in rooms that felt alive, personal, intimate. A place where art wasn't locked away from life, but integrated into it, made accessible in ways that honored both the artwork and the viewer. She didn't have to wait long. In 1891, Isabella's father died, leaving her $1.75 million, a staggering fortune in that era. For most wealthy women, such an inheritance meant security, comfort, the ability to maintain a pleasant lifestyle. For Isabella Stewart Gardner, it meant freedom. The freedom to become what she'd always wanted to be, a collector, a curator, a creator of spaces where art could speak directly to the human soul. She began in earnest. Advised by Bernard Berenson, a young art historian who would become one of the most influential connoisseurs of his generation, Isabella started acquiring works with a speed and confidence that shocked the art world. She purchased paintings by Botticelli, Titian, Rembrandt, and lesser-known masters whose work she recognized as extraordinary. She traveled constantly, haggling in auction houses across Europe, outbidding museums and rival collectors, building what would become one of the most important private art collections in America. In 1892, at a Parisian auction, Isabella acquired a painting that would become the jewel of her collection. The seller was the estate of Théophile Toré Berger, a French art critic who had devoted much of his career to resurrecting the reputation of forgotten Dutch masters. The painting was by Johannes Vermeer, an artist who had died poor and obscure in 1675, but whose work had been rediscovered in the 19th century as nothing short of genius. Only 36 paintings by Vermeer are known to exist. Some scholars question the attribution of a few more. But this one, there was no doubt. It was authentic. It was extraordinary. And Isabella wanted it. The painting was called The Concert. It showed 3 figures in a Dutch parlor, absorbed in making music together. A woman seated at a harpsichord, her lips slightly parted as she played. Another woman standing with sheet music, perhaps singing. A man with his back to the viewer, playing a lute. The scene radiated a mysterious quietness, Vermeer's signature quality. Light fell across the figures in that impossibly beautiful way Vermeer achieved, making simple domestic moments feel sacred, eternal. On the wall behind the musicians hung 2 paintings, one a pastoral landscape, the other a copy of a work by Dirk van Baburen showing a brothel scene. The contrast was deliberate. Vermeer often painted these quiet domestic mysteries, scenes that seemed to whisper about the complexity of human relationships, about love and desire and the many forms they take. Isabella bid against the National Gallery and the Louvre. She signaled her male agent with a wave of her handkerchief. Women at the time did not bid directly at auctions of such importance. She won $6,000. In a single bid, Isabella Stewart Gardner became a major player in the international art world. She brought The Concert back to Boston like a trophy, the first of what would become one of the greatest private collections of European and Asian art ever assembled in America. But Isabella didn't just want to own art. She wanted to create a place where others could experience it as she did, not as objects under glass, but as living presences in rooms that felt like homes. In 1896, she and Jack began planning a museum. They purchased land in the Fenway, an area of Boston that was still being developed. They designed a building that would be part Venetian palazzo, part personal fantasy. Isabella traveled through Europe, purchasing not just paintings, but architectural elements. Columns, balconies, doorways, windows, pieces of actual Renaissance buildings that she would incorporate into her own creation. Then, In 1898, Jack Gardner died suddenly. He had been her partner in everything, the one person who encouraged her unconventional passions and defended her against Boston's disapproval. His death could have ended the museum project. Instead, Isabella threw herself into it with even greater intensity. It would be her monument, not just to art, but to their life together. The construction of what Isabella called Fenway Court began in earnest. She visited the site daily, sometimes hourly. She demonstrated plastering techniques to the workmen. She took an axe to a Gothic beam that had been sanded too smooth, hacking it to give it the proper aged appearance. She designed the central courtyard herself, arranging plants and fountains and Roman sculptures in ways that created an atmosphere of serene beauty. She arranged every painting, every tapestry, every piece of furniture in the galleries according to her vision. This was not a museum organized by period or nationality. This was Isabella's personal arrangement: Renaissance paintings next to Asian ceramics, Roman sculptures beside medieval tapestries, all composed with an artist's eye for color, form, and emotional resonance. Fenway Court opened to the public on January 1st, 1903. The opening was called the Party of the Decade, perhaps the Party of the Century. Boston society, which had looked askance at Isabella for so long, now stood in the courtyard she had created and recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The philosopher William James, brother of novelist Henry James, described the scene as unbelievably beautiful. Isabella had created what she'd dreamed of since that day in Milan: a palace for art, a place where beauty lived not behind ropes and under cold lights, but in rooms that breathed with life. She made one condition, one non-negotiable rule that she wrote into her will with iron certainty: nothing could ever be moved, nothing could ever be sold. If the museum's trustees ever altered her arrangement, ever sold a single piece, the entire collection would be auctioned off and the proceeds given to Harvard University. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum must remain exactly as she created it, forever. Isabella lived in the museum until her death in 1924, occupying private quarters on the 4th floor. She was 84 years old when she died, having spent the last years of her life in a wheelchair after a series of strokes. She left behind a $1 million endowment to maintain the museum in perpetuity. And for 66 years, her palace stood exactly as she had arranged it. Art on the walls in her precise placement, furniture at the angles she'd chosen, even the plants in the courtyard maintained according to her specifications, until March 18th, 1990. The night everything changed. The building stood quiet in the darkness of early morning. It was a Sunday, technically. The clock had ticked past midnight, ending Saturday, beginning a new day. But across Boston, thousands of people were still celebrating. March 17th is St. Patrick's Day, and in Boston, with its massive Irish-American population, that meant parades and parties that stretched long into the night and well past any reasonable bedtime. The city's pubs were packed with revelers dressed in various shades of green, singing songs they only half remembered, toasting to Ireland and to each other and to anything else that seemed worth celebrating after enough pints of Guinness. The Boston Police Department had most of its officers concentrated in the South Boston area, managing crowds of people who had been drinking since the afternoon parade ended, watching for fights that might break out, keeping order in a city that was, for this one night, cheerfully determined to be disorderly. Boston takes St. Patrick's Day seriously. The city has the oldest such celebration in North America. The first parade was held in 1737, more than 250 years before this particular March 17th. For Boston's Irish community, which had grown from those first immigrants into one of the most significant Irish populations outside of Ireland itself, the day represented more than just a celebration of heritage. It was a statement of identity, a reminder that they had built this city as much as the Brahmins who looked down on them. A day when working-class Southie could be loud and proud and take up space in a city that often tried to make them feel small. The parade that Saturday had wound through South Boston's streets, drawing what witnesses estimated to be over 500,000 spectators. Bagpipes wailed their haunting melodies, brass bands played, children ran alongside the floats. Politicians waved from convertibles, knowing that St. Patrick's Day visibility in Boston was essential for anyone seeking office. The pubs opened early and stayed packed all day. By the time darkness fell, most of the city's police resources were dedicated to managing the aftermath, the drunk driving stops, the bar fights, the general chaos that comes when a city decides to throw itself a massive party. The Fenway neighborhood, where the Gardner Museum sat on its corner lot near the Museum of Fine Arts and Symphony Hall, was comparatively quiet. This was not the heart of Irish Boston. This was the cultural district, home to institutions and concert halls and academic buildings. The revelers were concentrated miles away in Southie, in the Irish pubs downtown, anywhere but here in this refined neighborhood of museums and music. A few people passed by the Gardner Museum around midnight. Witnesses would later report seeing two men in police uniforms sitting in a car near the side entrance. But on St. Patrick's Day weekend, seeing police officers waiting in their vehicle wasn't unusual. They were probably on a break, catching their breath between calls, waiting for the next drunk and disorderly complaint. Inside the museum, everything was as it should be. The motion detectors tracked movement through the galleries. The surveillance cameras recorded the entrances. And 2 security guards were on duty. This was standard for the night shift. 2 men, both young, both working a job that paid barely above minimum wage, somewhere around $7 or $8 an hour. These were not career security professionals. These were not guards with extensive training in art theft prevention or crisis management. These were young men working the night shift because it fit their schedules and because someone had to do it. The security director had requested higher salaries to attract more qualified applicants, but the museum's board, constrained by Isabella Gardner's directive against major expenditures, had denied the increase. An independent security consultant had reviewed the museum's systems in 1988 and recommended significant upgrades. These too had been denied, again because of budgetary concerns and Isabella's will, which forbade major renovations. So the security system in place on March 18, 1990, was what museum insiders and even some of the guards themselves described as prehistoric. There were motion detectors throughout the galleries that tracked movement through doorways. There was one panic button at the security desk. There were surveillance cameras at certain entrances, and there were 2 young men with walkie-talkies doing periodic rounds through the darkened rooms. Their names were Rick Abath and Randy Hestand. Abath was 23 years old, a Berklee College of Music dropout who played in a rock band and worked the night shift because it fit his schedule. He had long hair, a hippie aesthetic, and by his own later admission, he sometimes showed up to work having smoked marijuana or taken other substances. He hated the job. He made no secret of this. His fellow guards described him as someone who frequently complained about the poor training, the low pay, the boring hours. He was scheduled to attend a Grateful Dead concert in Hartford the following day and was looking forward to finally getting off this shift. Randy Hestand was 25, the other guard that night, similarly young and similarly inexperienced in any serious security work. Between them, these 2 men were responsible for protecting art worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The museum's security protocol was simple. One guard was supposed to remain at the security desk at all times, where the panic button could alert police to any emergency. The other guard was supposed to patrol the galleries with a flashlight and walkie-talkie, checking rooms on a rotating schedule. They would switch positions periodically through the night. It was March 18th, approaching 1 o'clock in the morning. Rick Abath was at the security desk. Randy Hestand was somewhere in the building on patrol. Then the fire alarms went off. Not just one, multiple alarms in several different rooms. Abath got up from the desk and walked through the galleries, checking each location where the alarm panel indicated smoke. He found nothing. No fire, no smoke. Nothing that would explain the alarms. This wasn't entirely unusual. The system was old and prone to malfunctions. Abath assumed it was just another glitch, disabled the alarm panel, and continued his patrol. Before returning to the security desk, Abath did something he later claimed was part of his normal routine, though investigators would question this extensively. He walked to the side entrance of the museum and briefly opened the door, then closed it again. He told no one he was doing this. He didn't inform Hestand via walkie-talkie. He just opened the door into the night and shut it again. According to Abath, he was checking to make sure it was securely locked, a procedure he said he'd been trained to follow. But the motion detectors recorded this action. 23 minutes past midnight. The side door opening and closing. Abath returned to the security desk around 1 o'clock. Hestand took over patrol duties. The museum settled back into its nighttime rhythm, that profound silence that fills buildings after closing when all the visitors are gone and the art exists in its own quiet world. At 1:24 in the morning, the buzzer rang at the side entrance, the same entrance where Abath had opened the door less than an hour earlier. Abath walked to the intercom and pressed the button to hear who was there. "Boston Police," a voice said through the speaker. "We're responding to a disturbance call." This made sense. It was St. Patrick's Day weekend. There had been parties in the area. A disturbance call wasn't unusual. Abath could see through the video monitor 2 figures in police uniforms standing outside. They looked official. They sounded official. They were responding to a call, doing their job. Rick Abath made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite the museum's security protocol, which explicitly stated that guards should never open the door for anyone during overnight hours, he buzzed them in. He opened the employee entrance and let 2 men in police uniforms into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The men stepped inside. They were calm, professional. One was shorter, one was taller. Both wore legitimate-looking Boston police uniforms. The shorter one addressed Abath directly. "You look familiar," he said. "We think you might be wanted on a warrant. Can we see your ID?" This was a brilliant psychological move. Abath, who had a Grateful Dead concert the next day, who sometimes showed up to work high, who fit the profile of someone the police might be looking for, he immediately became defensive, cooperative. He didn't want trouble. He reached for his ID and walked out from behind the security desk to show it to them. In that moment, Rick Abath moved away from the only panic button in the building. "We need to get a better look at you," the shorter man said. "Step away from the desk." Abath complied. He moved into the open area near the entrance, where the 2 officers could see him better. And then, with swift efficiency, the shorter man grabbed Abath's arms and forced them behind his back. Handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The taller man moved past them, deeper into the museum. "This is a robbery," one of them said. "Don't give us any trouble and you won't get hurt." Randy Hestand walked into the lobby at that moment, returning from his patrol. He saw Rick Abath in handcuffs. He saw 2 men in police uniforms. Before he could process what was happening, the taller man turned him toward the wall and handcuffed him as well. "We're going to take care of you guys," one of the thieves said. His voice was calm, almost reassuring. "Just cooperate, and this will all be over soon." They wrapped duct tape around the guards' heads, covering their eyes and mouths, but leaving their noses clear so they could breathe. The duct tape on Abath was particularly extensive, wrapped from his forehead down to his chin, immobilizing his entire head. Then, without asking for directions, without any hesitation about where to go, the thieves led both guards down to the basement. This would become one of the many suspicious details investigators would focus on later. The thieves knew exactly where the basement was. They moved through the building as if they'd been there before, as if they'd studied the layout. In the basement, they handcuffed Abath to an electrical conduit box and he stand to a workbench. They checked the guards' wallets, noted their addresses. "We know where you live," one of them said. "If you don't give us any problems, if you don't talk to the police, you'll get a reward in about a year. Otherwise, we know where to find you." It was 1:35 in the morning. The guards were secure in the basement, unable to see, unable to call for help. The thieves had just spent less than 15 minutes subduing the only two people who could stop them. And now, for the next 81 minutes, they had the entire Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum to themselves. The motion detectors told part of the story, not the whole story. There were gaps, moments when the system failed to record movement, but enough to create a timeline of what happened next. The thieves moved with purpose, but without apparent rush. They seemed to know exactly what they wanted and where to find it. Their first destination was the second floor, to a gallery called the Dutch Room. This was where Isabella Gardner had placed her most valuable paintings, works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other Dutch masters. The room was intimate, designed to feel like a wealthy Dutch merchant's home from the 17th century. Rich fabrics hung on the walls. Period furniture arranged with Isabella's characteristic attention to aesthetic balance. And paintings, some of the greatest works of the Dutch Golden Age, hanging in heavy, gilded frames. The thieves went straight to Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was Rembrandt's only seascape, painted in 1633, depicting the biblical story from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus calms a storm that threatens to sink the disciples' boat. The painting was dramatic, full of motion and terror, waves crashing, men struggling with the sail, Christ sleeping peacefully in the midst of chaos. It was worth, even in 1990, an estimated $140 million. The thieves smashed the protective glass covering the painting. Then they took a knife and cut the canvas from its frame. Not carefully, not with the precision of trained art thieves who understand the value of keeping paintings intact. They cut roughly, leaving portions of the canvas still attached to the frame, damaging the edges. Shards of glass fell to the floor. Fragments of painted canvas were left behind. Next to this, Rembrandt hung another work by the same artist. A Lady and Gentleman in Black, a formal portrait from 1633 showing a wealthy couple in the somber dress of Dutch Calvinists. This one they also cut from its frame. On the same wall hung a small etching by Rembrandt, barely larger than a postage stamp, a self-portrait. They took this too, though this particular etching had been stolen before, back in 1970, and recovered. Now it was stolen again. And then there was The Concert, Vermeer's masterpiece, the painting Isabella Gardner had fought to acquire at that Paris auction. One of only 36 known Vermeers in the world, the most valuable painting in the museum, worth at least $250 million by conservative estimates. Some experts believe it may be the single most valuable, unrecovered stolen painting in the world. The thieves removed The Concert from its frame. Unlike the Rembrandts, they didn't cut this one. They took the entire canvas off its stretcher more carefully as if they understood this painting's particular significance. The painting had been displayed back-to-back with another work on a small table in the Dutch room. When they took the concert, they also took the painting it had been paired with, Landscape with an Obelisk, which had long been attributed to Rembrandt, but had recently been quietly reattributed to his pupil Govert Flinck. The thieves may not have known about this reattribution. They may have thought they were taking another Rembrandt. From the same table, they grabbed a small object, an ancient Chinese bronze beaker called a gu, dating from the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years old. Why they took this particular object remains a mystery. It was valuable, certainly, but it didn't fit any pattern. It wasn't a painting. It wasn't European. It was just an exquisite ancient bronze vessel, and for some reason, they wanted it. The motion detectors recorded them moving through the Dutch room for roughly 23 minutes. Then they went to the opposite end of the second floor, to a narrow hallway called the Short Gallery. Here hung different treasures, 5 sketches by Edgar Degas showing horses and riders at various racetracks. The thieves took all 5 small works on paper, studies that Degas had created as preparation for larger paintings. Why these particular Degas sketches? Again, the pattern made no sense. They passed by other valuable works to take these 5 small drawings. In the Short Gallery, the thieves attempted something strange. They began unscrewing the frame that held a Napoleonic battle flag, apparently trying to steal the entire flag. But they didn't complete the job. Some screws were removed, others weren't. In the end, they gave up on the flag itself and instead took only the decorative finial that topped the flagpole, a small bronze eagle. Why they wanted this particular piece, what value it held for them beyond its material worth, no one can say. It was a bizarre choice, seemingly random, completely inconsistent with the sophisticated selections they'd made in the Dutch room. The motion detectors showed them spending time near the Blue Room on the first floor, but here the record becomes strange. According to the detectors, no one entered the Blue Room during the time the thieves were in the building. The only recorded motion in that room came from Rick Abath during his earlier patrol at 12:27 and 12:53 in the morning, before the thieves had even entered the museum. Yet a painting was stolen from the Blue Room. Edouard Manet's Chez Tortoni, a small portrait of a man in a top hat sitting at the famous Parisian café. The painting's frame was found later on the security director's desk, as if it had been carried there deliberately. But if the motion detectors never recorded anyone in the Blue Room during the heist, how was the painting stolen? Either the detectors malfunctioned, or someone had been in that room before the official heist began, or the thieves somehow moved through the room in a way that didn't trigger the sensors. This mystery would fuel decades of speculation about whether the heist was an inside job, whether Rick Abath had been involved in planning the robbery, whether he had removed the Manet from its frame during his earlier patrol and staged it for the thieves to collect. At 2:45 in the morning, the motion detectors recorded the thieves making 2 trips to the side entrance, carrying their stolen goods. They loaded the art into their vehicle. Witnesses later reported seeing a car that might have been a hatchback parked on Palace Road, near the side entrance. At 2:45, they left. 81 minutes after they'd entered. 13 works of art stolen. Total estimated value, even in 1990 dollars, approximately $500 million. Before they left, they checked on the guards one final time. "Are you comfortable?" one of them asked. The guards, still bound and duct-taped in the basement, could only nod or make muffled sounds through the tape. The thieves seemed genuinely concerned that the guards weren't in danger. They hadn't hurt anyone. They hadn't shown weapons. They'd been almost courteous throughout, in their way. And then they were gone. The museum fell silent again. Rick Abath and Randy Heastand remained handcuffed in the basement, unable to see, unable to call for help. Abath would later say he sang Bob Dylan's "I Shall Be Released" over and over to calm himself, to keep panic at bay during those 7 hours before morning staff would arrive and discover them. I shall be released. The song's opening verse must have felt brutally appropriate. They say every man needs protection. They say every man must fall. Yet I swear I see my reflection, someplace so high above this wall. The morning staff arrived around 8:15 on Sunday morning. They couldn't get into the museum. The doors were locked from the inside, which was unusual. They called the Boston Police Department, real police this time. Officers arrived and made their way inside, following the sounds of muffled voices, until they found Rick Abath and Randy Heastand still handcuffed in the basement, duct tape wrapped around their heads, exhausted and frightened after 7 hours of captivity. The officers freed them and began moving through the building, and with each room they entered, the scope of the catastrophe became clearer. The Dutch room with its smashed frames and empty spaces where masterpieces had hung. The short gallery missing its Degas sketches. The blue room with Chez Tortoni gone from the wall. Shards of glass on the floor. Pieces of canvas left behind in the frames. The videotape from the surveillance system taken. The motion detector hard drive data, fortunately, still intact. The thieves hadn't realized that simply removing the videotape wasn't enough to erase all record of their movements. Anne Hawley, the museum's director, received the call that morning. She had been director for only 6 months, the first woman to hold the position in the museum's history. She'd been hired to help modernize the museum's operations, to strengthen its financial position. Just months before the heist, she'd faced a difficult choice: invest in a new climate control system to protect the collection from environmental damage, or upgrade the security systems. She'd chosen climate control. The decision had seemed reasonable at the time. Museums worry about humidity and temperature fluctuations that can damage art over years and decades. The idea that someone would actually rob the Gardner Museum, that the security vulnerabilities would be exploited so completely, had seemed like a remote possibility. Now that remote possibility had become the worst nightmare in the museum's history. Anne Hawley stood in the Dutch room that morning and looked at the empty frames where Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee and The Concert had hung. She would later describe the feeling as looking at wounds. The empty frames looked like injuries to the room itself, to Isabella Gardner's vision, to the very concept of what the museum was supposed to be. The FBI was called immediately. This was clearly a federal case. Art theft across state lines, possibly international trafficking of stolen goods, the largest property crime in American history by dollar value. The FBI's art crime team, along with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts, took over the investigation. They began with the obvious questions. Who were the 2 men in police uniforms? Where did they go? And most importantly, where was the art? The investigation started with Rick Abath and Randy Heastand. In any museum theft, you look first at the guards. Statistics show that approximately 80% of museum thefts are inside jobs. The Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre in 1911 by a museum employee. The pattern is consistent. The people with access, with knowledge of security systems, with an understanding of when the museum is most vulnerable, these are often the people involved in the theft. Rick Abath became the focus of intense scrutiny. His actions that night raised numerous red flags. Why had he opened the side door 23 minutes before the thieves arrived? He claimed it was part of his routine security check, but other guards said this wasn't standard procedure. Why hadn't he pressed the panic button when the supposed police officers asked him to step away from the desk? Why were the only footsteps in the Blue Room his own from his earlier patrol, yet a painting from that room was stolen? The implication was clear. Had Abath removed the Manet during his rounds and placed it somewhere for the thieves to collect? And there were other details about Abath's behavior that seemed suspicious. He'd admitted to using marijuana and alcohol before work. He'd told investigators, years later, that he occasionally used LSD and cocaine during that period of his life. The night before the heist, surveillance video showed Abath letting an unauthorized person into the museum. Someone who came to the security desk spoke with Abath briefly, then left. Investigators pressed Abath about this visitor. Who was it? What did they want? Abath couldn't remember. It had been 25 years since that night, he said. He had no idea who the person might have been. Investigators eventually determined through their own research that the late-night visitor was someone with legitimate museum business, actually the deputy director of security, checking on the night guards. It was an innocent encounter. But Abath's inability to remember it, his vague responses about his activities that night, his history of substance use, all of it created a cloud of suspicion that would follow him for the rest of his life. Abath passed 2 polygraph tests. He cooperated fully with investigators, answering every question, submitting to multiple interviews over the years. The FBI agent who led the early investigation concluded that Abath and Heistand were simply incompetent and foolish. Young men working a low-wage job they weren't qualified for, who made catastrophic mistakes but weren't actually part of a criminal conspiracy. Still, the questions persisted. Many investigators believed Abath knew more than he admitted. Some thought he'd been involved in planning the heist. Others thought he might have been unwittingly manipulated by the real thieves, perhaps opening that side door as a signal without fully understanding what he was doing. Rick Abath would carry this burden for 34 years. Every article about the heist mentioned his name. Every documentary featured his interview. He gave a statement to National Public Radio in 2015 where he talked about the psychological weight of being associated with the greatest art theft in history. Even if they get the paintings back, they'll never be the same, he said. And I feel horrible about that. I don't want to be remembered for this alone. I'd like to be remembered for the good things I've done. I'm a husband, a father of 2 really cool kids, but it's $500 million worth of artwork, and ultimately, I'm the one who made the decision to buzz them in. He died in February of 2024 at his home in Vermont. He was 57 years old. He maintained his innocence until the end. His attorney told reporters, "Sadly, it's the death of a good person. For him, it was just being in the wrong place at the wrong time." But if Abath wasn't involved, then who was? The FBI investigation turned to Boston's criminal underworld, and there they found no shortage of suspects. Boston in 1990 was in the middle of a mob war. The Patriarcha crime family, which had dominated New England organized crime for decades, was fracturing. Internal power struggles had led to murders, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Several theories emerged about how this criminal landscape might connect to the Gardner heist. One theory centered on a gangster named Bobby Donati. Donati was a career criminal with ties to organized crime, known for his involvement in various thefts and schemes around Boston. According to this theory, Donati organized the Gardner heist as a bargaining chip to secure the release of Vincent "Vinny" Ferrara, his capo in the Patriarcha family, who was in prison on racketeering charges. The idea was that Donati could use the stolen art to negotiate Ferrara's freedom, either by offering to return the paintings in exchange for reduced charges, or by using the art's value to fund legal efforts. There was circumstantial evidence supporting this theory. An informant told investigators that Donati had visited Ferrara in prison about 3 months before the heist and told Ferrara he was planning something that would get him out. 3 months later, the Gardner robbery happened. Donati allegedly visited Ferrara again after the heist and confirmed he'd been involved, claiming he'd buried the artwork somewhere safe and would begin negotiations once the investigation cooled down. But those negotiations never happened. In September of 1991, 18 months after the Gardner heist, Bobby Donati was found dead in the trunk of a car. He'd been beaten and stabbed multiple times. His murder was never solved, but investigators believed it was related to the ongoing Patriarca family gang war. If Donati had orchestrated the Gardner heist, the secret of where the art went died with him. Another theory focused on a criminal named Carmelo Merlino, who ran an auto body shop in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood. Merlino was connected to various criminal enterprises and had ties to the Boston mob. In 1992, Merlino was arrested on drug trafficking charges. During interrogation, he told authorities he could help recover the Gardner paintings in exchange for a reduced sentence. He asked an associate named David Turner to track down the paintings. As some reports suggest, Turner claimed he heard the paintings were in a church in South Boston, but he never produced them. The FBI believes Turner may have been one of the actual thieves who entered the museum that night. Turner matches the description of one of the men in police uniforms: his height, his build, the way witnesses described his movements. But Turner has consistently denied any involvement. He's never been charged. And without hard evidence, fingerprints, DNA, video footage that clearly shows his face, the FBI can't prove their suspicion. In March of 2013, the FBI made a dramatic announcement. They held a press conference and stated that they had identified the thieves with a high degree of confidence. They believed the men were members of a criminal organization based in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. They believed the art had been transported from Boston to Connecticut and then to the Philadelphia area at various points over the years. They appealed to anyone with information to come forward. But they didn't release the names of the suspects, and they didn't recover the art. The announcement created a flurry of media attention, but led nowhere. The suspects the FBI had in mind were dead. They died in the years following the heist. Even if investigators were certain they knew who had carried out the robbery, that knowledge didn't bring the paintings home. Another name that surfaced repeatedly was James Whitey Bulger, one of Boston's most notorious crime bosses. Bulger led the Winter Hill Gang and had corrupted numerous Boston police officers, creating a network of protection that allowed him to operate with near impunity for years. Some investigators theorized that Bulger might have been involved in the Gardner heist, or at least knew about it, because the museum was in his territory and nothing that significant happened in Boston's criminal world without Whitey Bulger knowing about it. But Bulger denied any involvement. More than that, according to reports, Bulger actually tried to identify the culprits himself after the heist because he was angry that such a major crime had been committed in his area without his permission or participation. He wanted to be paid tribute, a cut of the profits. The thieves had cut him out, and that offended him. Bulger remained a fugitive for 16 years, one of the FBI's most wanted criminals, before being captured in 2011. He was eventually convicted of multiple murders and racketeering charges and died in prison in 2018. He never confessed to involvement in the Gardner heist, and investigators ultimately concluded he probably wasn't connected to it. There were stranger theories. Some people believed members of the Irish Republican Army had stolen the paintings to fund their operations. Others thought Japanese organized crime groups might have commissioned the theft. Some speculated that a wealthy private collector had hired professional thieves to steal specific works for a private collection. The problem with most of these theories was they didn't explain the bizarre selection of items stolen. Why take 5 Degas sketches, but leave other Degas works? Why steal a Napoleonic eagle finial? Why take a Chinese bronze beaker? The items didn't follow any logical pattern for professional art thieves working for a collector or for criminals trying to maximize value. Over the years, the FBI pursued thousands of leads. They investigated tips from around the world. They interviewed hundreds of people connected to Boston's criminal underworld. They offered rewards. First $1 million, then $5 million, eventually $10 million, the largest reward ever offered by a private institution for stolen art. They assured anyone with information that the museum wasn't interested in prosecution, only in getting the art back. They guaranteed confidentiality to anyone who came forward. Nothing worked. Every lead evaporated. Every promising tip led to a dead end. Informants who claimed to know where the paintings were hidden turned out to be lying or mistaken. Supposed negotiations for the return of the art collapsed when the intermediaries couldn't actually produce the paintings. In the years after the heist, the museum made a decision that was both practical and symbolic. In 1994, 4 years after the theft, they began rehanging the empty frames in the galleries where the stolen works had been displayed. The frames were restored, conserved, and placed back on the walls in their original positions, exactly where Isabella Gardner had hung them nearly a century earlier. The empty frames became one of the most haunting features of the museum. Visitors walk into the Dutch room and see them immediately. The gilded rectangles on the wall, containing nothing but blank space. The wall itself, where the paint has faded around the frames over the decades, creating ghostly rectangles slightly darker than the empty centers. These are the shadows of paintings that hung there for 90 years and have been gone for 35. Holly Salmon, the museum's director of conservation, explained the decision. They're really there as a reminder of what happened, and this symbol of hope for that return. The museum isn't complete until those pieces come back. The empty frames wait. They're maintained, conserved, protected. When the Dutch room underwent a major restoration starting in 2025, the frames themselves were carefully restored, along with the room's 16th century Italian painted ceiling and wall textiles. Everything is being prepared for the eventual return of the paintings. If they return. When they return. The museum operates on hope, because despite 35 years of investigation, despite $10 million in reward money, despite countless books and documentaries and podcasts examining every detail of the case, the art has never been recovered, not a single piece, not even a confirmed sighting. There have been claims, of course. People who say they've seen the paintings, who know where they are, who can negotiate their return. In the mid-1990s, an attorney named William Youngworth claimed he could help recover the art. He provided what he said were paint chips from The Storm on the Sea of Galilee as proof. Tests showed the paint chips were indeed from 17th century paintings, but they couldn't definitively confirm they came from the stolen Rembrandt. Youngworth demanded full immunity from prosecution and the release of his associate, convicted art thief Miles Connor Jr., who was in prison at the time. The FBI refused to meet all his conditions. The negotiations collapsed. The paintings never materialized. In 2021, a Boston jeweler named Paul Calantropo came forward with information. He claimed that in the spring of 1990, his longtime friend Bobby Donati, the same Bobby Donati suspected of organizing the heist, had shown him the stolen Napoleonic eagle finial. Calantropo said he'd kept quiet for years because he feared for his safety. When he finally told investigators about this in 2016, they were interested but couldn't confirm the story. Donati had been dead for decades. There was no physical evidence. The eagle finial, like everything else, remained missing. In 2022, investigators announced they were looking into a possible connection between the Gardner heist and the unsolved murder of Jimmy Marks, a hustler and convicted bank robber who was shot execution-style outside his Lynn, Massachusetts apartment in February 1991, 11 months after the heist. The killer had unscrewed the light bulb over Marks's front door to ensure he wouldn't see what was coming. It was a classic mob hit. Some believe Marks was killed because he knew too much about the Gardner theft. Others think his murder was unrelated, just one more casualty of Boston's mob wars during that violent period. The truth is, nobody knows. Nobody knows who pulled the trigger. Nobody knows why Marks was killed. And nobody knows if his death has anything to do with 13 missing artworks worth $500 million. The FBI continues to investigate. Anthony Amore, the museum's director of security and chief investigator, has been working on the case since 2005. He's interviewed everyone he can find who might have information. He's talked to every major criminal in Boston from that era who's still alive. He's chased leads to Europe, to Japan, to South America. He remains convinced the art still exists. "I've spoken to everybody," he said in a 2025 interview. "I've spoken to every criminal that you've ever heard of, the most powerful criminals in the state over the course of 20 years. I'm certain the paintings haven't been destroyed." His certainty is based partly on the nature of stolen art. Masterpieces don't just disappear. They're too valuable, too recognizable. You can't sell a stolen Vermeer on the open market. Every museum, every auction house, every legitimate art dealer in the world knows about the Gardner theft. The paintings are in the FBI's National Stolen Art File. They're in Interpol's database. They're listed by every international organization that tracks stolen cultural property. If someone tried to sell them, if they appeared at auction or in a gallery anywhere in the world, they would be identified immediately and seized. So if the paintings still exist, they're hidden. Perhaps in a climate-controlled storage facility somewhere, wrapped and preserved by someone who understands their value. Perhaps in a private collector's hidden gallery, viewed only by the person who commissioned the theft. Perhaps in the hands of criminals who can't figure out how to monetize them, who are stuck with assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars that they can't actually convert to cash. Perhaps divided and scattered, individual pieces hidden in different locations, held by different people who got them through various criminal transactions over the decades. Some experts believe the paintings were damaged during the theft itself, cut from their frames so roughly, transported without proper care, stored in conditions that would cause deterioration over time. The storm on the Sea of Galilee was slashed from its frame with a knife. The edges were damaged. If it's been rolled up for 35 years, if it's been exposed to humidity or temperature fluctuations, if it hasn't been properly conserved, the damage could be extensive. The masterpieces that emerge, if they ever emerge, might be shadows of what they once were. But museums have conservators. Damage can be repaired, at least partially. Even a damaged Vermeer is still a Vermeer. Even a damaged Rembrandt is still a Rembrandt. The museum would take them back in any condition. The $10 million reward is offered for their return in good condition. But the museum has made clear they want the art back regardless of condition. They'll restore what they can. They'll preserve what remains. They'll hang the paintings back in their original positions, back in Isabella Gardner's arrangement, back where they belong. There's precedent for optimism, in a way. Stolen art often doesn't resurface for decades, even generations. Paintings stolen during World War II are still being recovered and returned to their rightful owners 80 years later. Art stolen in the 1960s and 70s sometimes reappears in the 2020s when an elderly person dies and their heirs discover valuable artwork hidden in an attic or basement. Someone inherits a house and finds masterpieces wrapped in cloth in a storage room. Someone buys a storage unit at auction and discovers paintings they don't recognize, but that turn out to be listed in the stolen art databases. Anthony Amore has said repeatedly that he believes someone will eventually find the Gardner paintings. Someone going through a deceased relative's belongings. Someone cleaning out a property. Someone who realizes what they're looking at and makes the call. Someone is going to be looking in an attic and find these pieces. Retired FBI agent Jeffrey Kelly told reporters, "There's always hope." But 35 years is a long time. The thieves, whoever they were, are likely dead. Most of the major suspects investigators identified have died. Bobby Donati was murdered in 1991. Carmelo Merlino died in 2005. George Reisfelder and Leonard DiMuzio, two men the FBI identified as likely suspects in 2013, both died shortly after the heist. Reisfelder of a cocaine overdose in 1991. DiMuzio, in circumstances that remain unclear around the same time. David Turner, another suspect, is in prison on unrelated charges and continues to deny involvement. Whitey Bulger died in 2018. The people who might know where the art went are no longer available to tell. And as more time passes, as another generation comes of age, as the world moves further away from 1990, the likelihood of recovery diminishes. The thieves' associates and confederates, the people who might have heard something, who might have seen something, who might know something, they're aging, dying, taking their secrets with them. But the museum waits. The empty frames wait. And sometimes, when you stand in the Dutch room and look at those rectangular shadows on the wall, you can almost see them, the paintings that hung there for so long. Christ in the storm on the Sea of Galilee, with its dramatic waves and terrified disciples. The concert, with its mysterious musicians frozen in Vermeer's perfect light. A lady and gentleman in black, in their formal Calvinist dignity. The paintings exist somewhere in the collective memory of everyone who ever saw them, everyone who studied them, everyone who stood in this room and felt what Isabella Gardner wanted people to feel when she arranged this space. The profound power of great art to connect us to beauty, to history, to the human capacity for creating something that transcends our brief lives. The theft violated more than just property laws. It violated Isabella Gardner's vision. She built this museum to share these specific works in this specific arrangement with the public forever. She wrote that condition into her will with absolute certainty. Nothing can be moved, nothing can be sold, everything must remain as I placed it. For 90 years, the museum honored that directive. The paintings hung exactly where she put them, in frames she selected, on walls she had decorated, in rooms she had designed. And then, in 81 minutes, two men in police uniforms destroyed that continuity. They cut paintings from frames Isabella Gardner herself had hung. They took art she had personally selected and purchased and carried home from Europe and arranged with such care. They violated not just the museum, but Isabella's vision, her legacy, her gift to Boston and to the world. The museum does what it can to maintain her vision, despite the loss. They keep the frames in position. They maintain the rest of the collection exactly as she arranged it. They tend the courtyard garden according to her specifications. They honor her directive that nothing be moved or sold. But the gaps remain. The wounds remain. The museum is incomplete, and it will remain incomplete until those 13 works return. If they return. There are moments when even the most optimistic observers wonder if the art still exists at all. Maybe it was destroyed decades ago. Maybe it's deteriorated beyond recognition. Maybe it's sitting in a landfill somewhere, discarded by criminals who realized they couldn't sell it and got rid of the evidence. Maybe it burned in a warehouse fire. Maybe it was damaged by water or mold or simple neglect to the point where even the canvases have disintegrated. These are the nightmare scenarios that everyone connected to the museum tries not to think about. Because if the art is truly gone, if it's been destroyed, then the loss is permanent in a way that's almost unbearable to contemplate. Those paintings existed for centuries. They survived wars and revolutions and natural disasters. They survived the death of their creators, the rise and fall of empires, centuries of changing tastes and values. And then they disappeared in one night, taken by two men whose names we still don't know for certain, for reasons we still don't understand. The story of the Gardner heist has become part of Boston's identity. It's one of those crimes that defines a city the way certain murders or robberies or cons become woven into local mythology. Everyone in Boston knows about the Gardner heist. It's been the subject of countless news articles, several books, multiple documentaries, and a podcast series called Last Seen, produced by WBUR and the Boston Globe, that examined every detail of the case over 10 episodes. Netflix released a 4-part documentary series in 2021 called This is a Robbery, that brought the story to a global audience. But for all the attention, for all the investigation, for all the theories and suspects and speculation, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who were the two men in police uniforms? How did they know what to take? Why did they select such a seemingly random assortment of items? Where did they go after they left the museum? Who helped them? Who bought the art from them, or stored it for them, or transported it for them? And where is it now? The FBI asks anyone with information to come forward. You can contact them at tips.fbi.gov or call 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can also contact the Gardner Museum directly at reward@gardnermuseum.org. The museum promises confidentiality. They promise the $10 million reward for information leading to the safe return of the stolen works. They're not interested in prosecuting anyone at this point. The statute of limitations for the theft itself has long since expired. They just want the art back. Because without those paintings, Isabella Gardner's palace remains incomplete. The frames wait on the walls like open wounds. The Dutch room, even after its careful restoration, feels haunted by absence. And everyone who visits the museum, who walks through those galleries and looks at the empty spaces, carries with them the same question. Will we ever see them again? The paintings themselves, wherever they are, continue to exist in a strange kind of limbo. They're the most famous stolen artworks in the world. They're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They're instantly recognizable to anyone with even passing knowledge of art history. And yet, they've vanished so completely that not even a credible sighting has been confirmed in 35 years. It's as if they've been erased from the world, removed from sight and touch and experience, existing now only in photographs and memories, and the empty frames that mark where they used to hang. Vermeer's The Concert alone represents a loss almost impossible to quantify. 36 Vermeer paintings are known to exist in the world. Just 36 works by one of history's greatest painters, an artist who worked slowly, carefully, creating small domestic scenes filled with mysterious light and quiet human moments. Losing one Vermeer means losing nearly 3% of his entire known output. It's as if 3% of Mozart's compositions vanished, or 3% of Shakespeare's plays disappeared from the archive. The loss isn't just financial, it's cultural, it's art historical. It's a wound in the collective human heritage. And the concert was special even among Vermeers. It showed three figures instead of the single figure or pair that Vermeer usually painted. It included musical instruments, one of Vermeer's favorite motifs. It demonstrated his characteristic ability to make simple moments feel profound, to fill domestic spaces with an atmosphere of mystery and contemplation. Art historians who studied it before the theft noted details that revealed Vermeer's working methods, his relationship with other Dutch painters, his evolving style in the mid-1660s. All of that knowledge is now inaccessible. You can look at photographs of the concert, but photographs can't capture the luminous quality of Vermeer's paint, the way light seems to emerge from within the canvas itself, the subtle textures and brushwork that reveal themselves only when you stand before the actual painting. The same is true for the Rembrandts, for the Degas sketches, for every piece that was stolen. What was taken wasn't just monetary value. What was taken was the irreplaceable experience of standing before these works, of seeing them as Isabella Gardner intended, of having the opportunity to look at art that connects us to centuries of human creativity and thought and feeling. Some people find strange comfort in the empty frames. They say there's something powerful about the absence, something that makes you think about what was lost in a way that the actual paintings never did. When the paintings were on the walls, they were just there. Beautiful, certainly, but familiar to regular visitors, easy to take for granted. Now that they're gone, their absence has weight. The empty frames force you to imagine what hung there. They force you to confront the fragility of our cultural heritage, the way things we assume will always be here can vanish in a single night. They're monuments to loss, to the fact that nothing is truly secure, that even the greatest museums with the best intentions can be vulnerable. But most people just want the paintings back. They want to walk into the Dutch room and see The Storm on the Sea of Galilee in its proper place, dramatic and powerful, and exactly where Rembrandt painted it to be seen. They want to stand before the concert and experience what Isabella Gardner experienced when she first saw it at that auction in Paris. The recognition that you're looking at something extraordinary, something that speaks across centuries, something that justifies the very existence of museums and collections and the human drive to preserve beauty. The investigation continues. The frames wait, and somewhere, possibly in a climate-controlled vault, possibly in an attic wrapped in cloth, possibly deteriorating in conditions that would make conservators weep, possibly destroyed beyond recovery or recognition, 13 works of art exist in a state of suspension between lost and found. This is where the story stops for now. Not with resolution, but with waiting. Not with answers, but with questions that grow more urgent and less likely to be answered with each passing year. Two men in police uniforms walked into a museum on March 18, 1990. 81 minutes later, they walked out with $500 million in art. 35 years later, we still don't know their names for certain. We don't know where they went. We don't know what happened to the art they stole. We only know that somewhere in the world, the concert still exists in some form. Three figures making music in a Dutch parlor, painted by Vermeer in the mid-1660s, acquired by Isabella Gardner in 1892, stolen in 1990, and unseen by anyone outside the criminal world ever since. The most valuable stolen painting in the world. A masterpiece in exile. Waiting, like the empty frames in the Dutch room, for the moment when it might finally come home. If you have information about the Gardner heist, the FBI and the museum are still waiting for your call. The $10 million reward still stands. The frames still hang on the walls, prepared and waiting. And the question remains, whispered in galleries and discussed in documentaries and debated by investigators and art lovers around the world. Where are the paintings? As you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine them. Imagine the concert in its mysterious stillness. Imagine the storm-tossed disciples in Rembrandt's seascape crying out to sleeping Christ. Imagine Isabella Gardner in her Venetian palace, arranging these works with such care, creating a space where beauty would live forever. And imagine, perhaps, that somewhere those paintings still exist intact, preserved, waiting, ready to tell their stories again when they finally return to the museum where they belong. The empty frames wait in the darkness of the Dutch room. The reward stands unclaimed, and the greatest art heist in history remains, 35 years later, unsolved. As for you, my friend, I wish you a good night and the sweetest dreams. Come back the next night. I'll be here waiting for you to tell you another mystery.